During World War II, the Allied forces of the United States, Canadian and British forces launched an invasion of Normandy in France to liberate the French forces from the Germans. The attacks were launched simultaneously on 5 separate beachheads, leading into Normandy, and by the end of August 1944, all of northern France was liberated. The events of this day make up what's now popularly referred to as D-Day in modern history. And following the success of Normandy, the Allied forces deliberated on the plan to invade Germany and eventually bring an end to the reign of the Third Reich. In today's video, we would be detailing the grueling experience of the Allied forces on D-Day of World War II during the fierce battle for Normandy. But before we get right into it, kindly support this channel by giving this video a like, hitting the subscribe button and smashing the notification bell to receive notifications of when we post more enthralling historical videos like this one. Do leave us a comment as well, as we'd love to read your opinion on the historic D-Day battle. Now, let's dive in. The D-Day invasion, also called the Normandy invasion or Operation Overlord, was launched by the Allied forces during World War II to liberate France from the Germans on June 6, 1944. The operation involved the simultaneous landing of the Allied forces of the United States, Britain, and Canada on 5 separate beaches in Normandy, France. The invasion is widely considered one of the largest amphibious military assaults in history and required extensive planning. Before the invasion, the Allied forces conducted a large-scale deception campaign to deceive the Germans about the intended point of invasion. By the end of August 1944, all of northern France that was previously occupied by Nazis was eventually liberated. This invasion would later lead to the drive into Germany, where the Allied forces eventually met with the Soviet forces advancing from the east to jointly put an end to Hitler's reign and Nazi agenda. The Normandy invasion officially marked the end of the war in Europe. Shortly after the Second World War began, Germany invaded and occupied the northwest region of France in 1940. The Americans entered the war in December 1941, and by 1942, the British, who had suffered previous casualties from the Germans in the Battle of the Maginot Line in France, joined the war, after considering the possibility of an alliance across the English Channel. The following years, plans were put in motion for a cross-channel invasion. By the summer of 1943, Nazi forces had fully occupied all of the territories gained during the Blitzkrieg campaign against France from 1939 to 41 and the Russian conquest of 1941 to 42. Hitler was, however, wary of an impending invasion along France's northern coast and put Erwin Rommel, a top Nazi military commander, in charge of leading defense operations in the region. But the major problem for the Germans was that they had no idea where the Allied forces would strike. Hitler ordered Rommel to oversee the completion of the Atlantic Wall, a 2,400-mile fortification of bunkers, landmines, and beach and water obstacles as a countermeasure against the impending invasion. In January 1944, General Dwight Eisenhower was appointed as the commander of the Allied forces Operation Overlord. The operation was designed for a landing in Normandy between Caen and the Cotentin Peninsula in the strength of 3 divisions, with 2 brigades to be airdropped. Another 11 divisions were to be landed within the first 2 weeks through artificial harbours that would be towed across the channel. Once a foothold had been established on the coast of Normandy, a force of 100 divisions, the majority shipped directly, would be assembled in France for a final assault on Germany. Hitler had always foreseen a possible cross-channel invasion by the Allied forces, but he continually downplayed their forces and had strong confidence in Nazi defences. Hitler largely considered the Allied forces have been badly dissipated by the Nazi army, and as such lacked the willpower to orchestrate the massive invasion that had been needed to defeat the Nazi army. In the months that preceded the month of the invasion, the Allied forces carried out a massive deception operation that was intended to make the Germans believe that they would invade France from Pas-de-Calais, which is the narrowest point between France and Britain, rather than their intended target position, which was Normandy. Also, the Allied forces were able to convince the Germans to think that they would attack from multiple locations by employing different deceptive tactics. Deployment of fake equipment, a phantom army commanded by George Patton and supposedly based in England, double agents, and fraudulent radio transmissions were all ploys employed by the Allied forces before the battle on the D-Day. The Germans were not altogether deluded because Hitler himself declared the last-minute premonition of a Normandy landing. Although May 1944 had been the earlier choice by the Allied forces to conduct the invasion, Difficulties in assembling landing craft forced a postponement to June, and by the 5th of June, the largest military operation in human history was set in motion. As D-Day approached and the troops began to embark on the crossing, bad weather conditions set in, posing dangerous landing conditions for troops. After a tense debate, Commander Eisenhower and his subordinates concluded on a 24-hour delay that required calling back some ships that were already at sea. On the morning of the 5th of June, Eisenhower's meteorologist James Martin Stagg predicted improved weather conditions for the following day, and Eisenhower gave the go-ahead for the invasion. An armada of 3,000 landing craft, 2,500 other ships, and 500 naval vessels, escorts, and bombardment ships began to leave English ports. Later that day, more than 5,000 ships and landing craft carrying troops and supplies left England for the trip across the Channel to France, while more than 11,000 aircraft were mobilized to provide aerial cover and support for the invasion. By dawn on the 6th of June, thousands of paratroopers and glider troops were already on the ground behind enemy lines, securing bridges and exit roads. The invasions began full steam at 6:30 a.m. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Division suffered many casualties by drowning when they dropped at an inundated zone at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. The British 6th Airborne Division seized its unflooded objectives at the eastern end more easily, and its Special Task Force successfully captured key bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River. The British and Canadian forces faced German forces on beaches codenamed Gold, Juno, Sword, and Utah, as did the Americans, but they overcame the opposition. However, at Omaha Beach, the US forces faced heavy and brutal resistance from the German forces. Over 2,000 American casualties were sustained by the day's end, but over 156,000 Allied troops succeeded in storming Normandy beaches. According to estimates, more than 4,000 Allied troops lost their lives in the D-Day invasion of 1944, with countless thousands wounded or missing. Less than a week, on the 11th of June, the beaches were already fully secured by the Allied forces, and over 326,000 troops, 50,000 vehicles, and over 100,000 tons of equipment had landed at Normandy. By the end of June, the Allied forces had been able to successfully seize the vital port of Cherbourg, landed over 850,000 men and 150,000 vehicles in Normandy, and were motivated to continue their march across France. The Germans suffered from confusion in their ranks and the absence of their celebrated commander Rommel, who was away on leave. Initially, Hitler believed the invasion was a feint designed to lure away the Germans from a coming attack north of the Seine River, and refused to release nearby divisions to join the counterattack. Reinforcements had to be called from further afield, causing delays. He also hesitated in calling for armoured support for the defence of German troops in Normandy. The Germans were also disadvantaged due to the effective Allied forces' air support that took out many of their key bridges and forced them to take long detours, as well as the efficient Allied naval support that helped protect advancing Allied troops. In the ensuing weeks, the Allied forces advanced and fought across the Normandy countryside, facing heavy German resistance as well as a dense landscape of marshes and hedgerows. The Germans were depressed because their bitter defense was using up men and equipment that could not be replaced. The setback brought the criticism of the German chain of command. German Commander Dollmann died suddenly from a heart attack on June 28th, just after the immediate surrender of the main garrison in Cherbourg. Erwin Rommel was also severely injured when his car was heavily strafed by a British fighter on July 17th. Rundstedt confessed defeat to Hitler and urged Hitler to make peace with the Allied forces, but he was dismissed on July 2nd along with Geyer, the commander of the Panzer Group West. The Germans displayed their expertise on the Seine River crossings. Although all bridges had been destroyed by the Allied forces, the Germans improvised by building pontoons and ferries and conducted skillful rearguard actions to hold off the Allied forces between August 19th and 31st. By then, the Allied forces controlled the west bank of the Seine River. The Germans would ultimately withdraw, with the convener of the German withdrawal being Field Marshal Walther Model, the Führer's fireman. As Model drew the retreating Germans back across northern France into Belgium, they were met with resistance forces on August 19th, and fighting ensued. The news of the struggle reached the public in the United States and Britain, and the recently arrived French 2nd Armoured Division was ordered to liberate the city of Belgium. The division arrived on August 24th, and the following morning the German city commander surrendered to the resistance. On August 26th, General Charles de Gaulle, head of the French, made a triumphal parade down the Notre Dame Cathedral, where victory was celebrated alas. Paris was liberated, and the Germans had been removed from northwestern France, effectively concluding the invasion of Normandy. The Allied forces then prepared to invade Germany, where they would meet up with the Soviet troops moving in from the east. Although the operation was hugely successful, it came at a very high cost for the Allied forces. Over 200,000 were dead, wounded, and missing from the Allied armies. German losses were over 300,000, and the French civilian losses totaled 12,000. The following spring, on May 8, 1945, the Allied forces formally accepted the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany.